Have you ever had someone walk beside you, not to lead, not to teach, but just to offer you enough steadiness so you could take your own step? If someone ever gave you that quiet kind of strength, by simply staying, by holding space. Because today's story isn't about saving someone. It's about a boy who couldn't dance. And the waitress who didn't teach him how, but let him stand tall by not stepping in. Some lifts don't come from hands. They come from silence, stillness, and the courage to wait. It was a quiet kind of Saturday night, the kind that wrapped itself in the hum of soft jazz and slow laughter. At the center of the restaurant, warm lights fell like liquid gold across tables dressed in white linen. Couples swayed gently on the dance floor, some out of rhythm but all in sync with something unspoken. In a corner booth, Mr. Landon Blake sat with his son. His tailored suit barely creased as he adjusted the phone on his lap, eyes flicking between work emails and half-sipped wine. A tech magnate in the field of biomedical engineering, he was known for building prosthetics that moved like flesh, artificial intelligence that responded like instinct. But none of that helped him understand how to move with his own child. Beside him, Elliot, 8 years old, sat with his hands curled in his lap. His right leg trembled every few seconds, not from nerves, but from a neurological condition that made walking unpredictable. Some days, he could cross a room with ease. Tonight, even standing felt like guesswork. He loved music. That much was clear. Each time a new song came on, Elliot's eyes would follow it, not with his ears, but with something deeper. He'd smile without showing teeth, tapping his fingers against his leg in quiet rhythm. But when his father offered, "Want to try the floor?" Elliot just shook his head. "No," he whispered, almost like it hurt to say it. Hazel watched them from across the room. She wasn't trying to. But something about Elliot, about the way he stayed still with so much effort, pulled her in. She had learned not to stare, but she noticed details most people didn't. The way the boy's fingers moved to the beat. The way his foot flexed slightly when someone near the dance floor laughed. Like his body wanted to go, but didn't know how. She moved through the tables with a grace that came less from years of serving, and more from the dance studio she had once called home. Before tips and rent and solitude. Before she had to stop moving for herself. As she refilled water at the Blake's table, she leaned a little toward Elliot. Her voice was low, almost playful. "You can use my shoes," she said. "I don't mind." Elliot looked up, confused. He didn't speak. Hazel stepped back slightly and pointed at her own black flats. "I mean it," she added. "Just step on. I'll do the moving. You just feel it." Mr. Blake looked up from his phone, eyes narrowing slightly. Hazel didn't meet his gaze. She kept her attention on the boy. Elliot blinked. Then slowly, he shifted in his seat, unsure. Hazel didn't rush him. She just stood there, hands at her side, feet planted gently apart like she was anchoring herself for both of them. And then, awkwardly, hesitantly, Elliot slid off the booth and let his small feet step on top of hers. They weren't perfect steps. One foot was a little late. The other didn't land where she expected. But Hazel adjusted, like it was part of the dance. Without a word, she moved in a slow sway. Left, pause. Right, wait. Elliot gripped her arms for balance at first. Then gradually, his hands relaxed. She didn't hold him tighter. She didn't lead. She just let him lean until he didn't have to. Across the room, a couple paused mid-dip to watch. Another table quieted. Mr. Blake, phone still in hand, slowly put it down. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't even a real dance. It was simply two people, one carrying, the other beginning to carry himself. No instructions. No guidance. No correction. Just permission. Elliot smiled. For the first time that night, it reached his whole face. Hazel disappeared for a moment. Elliot stood by the edge of the booth, still balancing on unsure legs, while Mr. Blake sat silently, hands folded now, the phone finally put away. When Hazel returned, she had swapped her black heels for a pair of soft-soled flats. They weren't fancy, just plain, well-worn, and flexible. She gave Elliot a little nod, as if to say, "Okay, let's try it for real now." She said nothing. Elliot hesitated, glancing up at his father, then down at her feet. Slowly, with deliberate care, he placed one foot, then the other, on top of hers. His right foot landed crookedly, half off the edge. The left foot slid a little before finding balance. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't centered. But Hazel didn't fix it. She didn't adjust his position. Didn't bend down to align his stance. She simply offered her hands, open and steady, palms up. Elliot reached out and placed his own small hands in hers. He was shaking just a little. Hazel didn't squeeze. She didn't steer. She just stood there, anchored, quiet. And then, she moved. It was more of a shift than a step. A gentle lean to the left, a careful sway to the right. Her steps were measured slow, so slow it barely registered as dancing. It wasn't about tempo or rhythm. It was about giving space. Giving Elliot the sensation of movement without demanding control. The freedom of motion without fear of falling. He blinked. Then blinked again. And something happened. His grip on her fingers loosened, not because he was letting go, but because he didn't need to cling. Hazel didn't lead. She followed his hesitation. Adjusted to his awkwardness. Met every misstep with stillness, every imbalance with calm. Around them, the restaurant quieted. Not entirely. Plates still clinked. A glass was filled. Laughter still bubbled from somewhere near the bar. But there was a subtle shift, as if the room leaned inward, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. From a few tables away, a woman tilted her head, watching with a soft smile. An older man paused mid-bite, fork hovering. One of the waiters, young, probably new, whispered under his breath to a coworker, just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "What is she even doing?" Hazel didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She didn't stop. And Elliot? He smiled. Not the uncertain kind, the polite, forced grin kids sometimes give adults when they don't know what else to do. This smile was full. Unfiltered. Like a spark had lit up from behind his eyes and made its way to his cheeks. His mouth parted slightly, like he was about to say something, then changed his mind. The moment was too whole to break. Each time they moved, just an inch, just a weight shift, it was a kind of victory. Not because of the distance covered, but because of what it took for Elliot to trust the ground beneath him, even if it wasn't really the ground. He was standing on someone else's shoes. But the dance was his. Hazel gave no instruction. No encouragement. No correction. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was permission. Permission to wobble. Permission to lean. Permission to be offbeat, off-center, and still be allowed to move. And in that simple act of standing still, of not correcting, not steering, Hazel became the kind of guide who doesn't walk ahead, but instead becomes the ground beneath someone's first real step. They kept swaying, barely moving, while the restaurant's normal buzz resumed. Someone clapped lightly after a song ended. Another couple joined the dance floor. A waiter passed with a tray of wine glasses, eyes glancing toward Hazel and Elliot before flicking away. But that moment, that tiny orbit of slowness between waitress and child, remained untouched. Mr. Blake watched in silence. It was hard to say what he was feeling. His face, so often disciplined and composed, held no easy expression. But he didn't look away. Not once. He didn't stand. Didn't interrupt. He simply sat, elbow resting on the table, watching his son do something he'd never seen before. Move, without needing to be held up. There was no coaching. No cheering. No proud announcement of "look what he can do." Just a quiet surrender to the moment. A trust that this strange, uneven, beautiful thing could be enough. Elliot's smile lingered. He looked up at Hazel like she had just shown him something no one else ever had. Not a trick, not a lesson, but a way of being. Of believing. Mr. Blake was mid-sentence when something in the air shifted. He had taken a video call at the far end of the restaurant's private lounge area, angled slightly toward the wall so the background would stay professional. The screen glowed softly against his face as he spoke to a group of investors from Berlin, discussing product integration timelines and regulatory approvals. His tone was sharp but controlled. He was the kind of man whose voice always landed like a decision. And if we fast-track the EU certification for the mobility line, he said, we can. He trailed off. His eyes drifted not out of distraction, but from something pulling at the edge of his attention, something not quite sound, not quite movement, but unmistakably real. He turned. At first, it didn't register. He saw Hazel. She was in profile, her face calm, almost meditative. She moved slowly, not with the practiced elegance of a ballerina, but with the deliberate gentleness of someone matching the pace of something fragile. Then he saw the small figure standing on her shoes. His son, Elliot. Tiny hands in hers, posture slightly off-center, feet placed unevenly but firmly atop Hazel's flats. They weren't gliding across the floor, they were barely moving at all. And yet, it was unmistakable. They were dancing. For a moment, Mr. Blake didn't move. His mind struggled to align the image before him with everything he had come to expect from Elliot. There had always been plans. Professionals. Therapies. Occupational schedules logged with military precision. So many steps, meticulously measured and charted. So many specialists, hired to help Elliot walk straighter, stronger, better. But none of them had ever brought that look to his son's face. Elliot's head tilted slightly as he whispered something. Mr. Blake couldn't hear it. So he took a step forward. Then another. Halfway across the floor, he stopped. He didn't want to interrupt. He wasn't even sure he belonged in the moment. There was something sacred in the stillness, the way Hazel let Elliot lead the slowness with his uncertainty. And then, just as Mr. Blake was about to call out, Elliot turned his head slightly, not all the way, just enough to see him, and murmured, just loud enough for his father to hear. "I'm dancing, Dad." The words weren't loud. They didn't land like a shout. They barely touched the air. But they echoed inside Blake like a bell struck in a hollow chest. "I'm dancing, Dad." He felt it in the space behind his ribs, where pride and confusion lived side by side. He should have smiled. He should have said something, anything. But his throat tightened, his jaw locked. Because for the first time, he didn't know what to say. He had paid more money than most people would earn in a decade to help his son move, to walk, to balance, to regain physical control. But no one had ever made Elliot want to move. And now here he was, on a stranger's shoes, led by silence, surrounded by the quiet warmth of slow jazz and low candlelight, and smiling. Mr. Blake didn't step closer. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly backed away, just one quiet step, returning to the table but not sitting down. He rested his hand on the back of his chair and watched. Elliot's face was lit with joy that didn't need approval. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't being evaluated or filmed for progress. He was simply present. Hazel's expression remained soft, unreadable. She looked neither proud nor surprised. She looked like someone who had seen this before, this kind of quiet rising that happens when you let a person meet themselves in their own time. Blake tried to remember the last time Elliot had looked at him like that. He couldn't. In his world, movement was data. Success was tracked by metrics. And yet this odd improvised shuffle between a child and a waitress, felt more like progress than any milestone chart. What do you do when your child takes a step without your help? What do you say when it's someone else's stillness, not your guidance, that gave them the courage? Mr. Blake swallowed hard. He had always believed in control. In precision. He had spent his life designing artificial limbs to give people command over their own bodies again. Yet here stood his son, moving not because of technology or therapy, but because someone had simply stood still and let him try. No push. No praise. Just space. He looked down at his own hands, hands that had signed papers, wired funds, issued commands. But right now, they had nothing to do. Nothing to fix. Nothing to hold. And so he did nothing. He let the moment pass untouched. Let the dance continue, imperfect and alive. Elliot shifted again, feet stumbling a little, and Hazel gently adjusted, not correcting, not leading, just absorbing the imbalance like it was part of the music. Mr. Blake closed his eyes for a second. It wasn't the kind of moment he had prepared for. But somehow, it was exactly what he needed to see. From across the room, the spell seemed unbreakable. The boy on her shoes. The slow, strange dance. The silent understanding between them. But not everyone understood. "Hey," a voice whispered near Hazel's shoulder. It was Mason, one of the newer waiters, barely 23, eager, nervous, still trying to figure out how much initiative was too much. He held a tray of empty glasses and leaned slightly, eyes darting toward Mr. Blake at the other end of the lounge. "Not to pry," Mason said under his breath, "but aren't you worried? About the dad, I mean." Hazel didn't answer right away. She shifted with Elliot, his weight wobbling slightly to the left, and her body matching it instinctively, as if her bones had memorized his hesitations. One of his feet slipped halfway off her shoe again. She didn't fix it. She didn't need to. Balance wasn't always about symmetry, it was about being carried, without knowing you were being carried. Mason cleared his throat. "I mean, the guy's a billionaire. One of those foundation sponsors types, right? Some parents get weird about this kind of thing." Hazel finally turned her head, just a little. "He's not watching me," she said quietly. "He's watching his son." Mason blinked. He looked again, this time really looking. Mr. Blake hadn't moved from his place near the table. His posture had softened, not slouched, but no longer rigid. His hands weren't clenched. His face wasn't impatient. And his eyes, they weren't fixed on Hazel. They were following every uncertain, wondrous move of Elliot, his own child, learning how to exist in motion, not because someone taught him, but because someone had followed him. Mason didn't say anything else. He just gave a quiet nod, shifted his tray to his other hand, and walked away. Hazel returned her focus to Elliot. He was turning slightly now. Testing it. A small, unsteady twist of his torso, as if wondering what would happen if he didn't just step but turned. Hazel adjusted her feet, still beneath his, just enough to pivot with him. Not leading. Not guiding. Just answering. Elliot let out the smallest laugh. A sound so light it nearly vanished between the low hum of jazz and the quiet buzz of the dining room. Then Hazel whispered, low enough that only Elliot could hear. "I'll move as long as you do." There was no audience for that line. No one to be impressed. It wasn't a promise made with grandeur. It was a vow made in silence, sealed by presence. Elliot's shoulders dropped a little. Not in defeat, but in trust. That kind of tiny surrender children only give when they know they won't be caught too soon, or let go too fast. He turned again, just a little wider this time. Hazel followed. Step by step, half steps really, they reshaped the floor beneath them. Not with choreography, but with agreement. Not with structure, but with listening. That was the difference. People always talked about helping kids like Elliot gain control, find balance, build confidence. But no one ever talked about what it meant to follow them. To let them lead their own way forward, even when that way was clumsy, ungraceful, unpredictable. Hazel wasn't guiding him toward strength. She was letting him borrow hers until he felt his own. There had been a time, not long ago, when Hazel herself couldn't move without fear. She remembered standing alone in her apartment, after her last performance had ended, staring at her worn dance shoes and wondering if she'd ever move just for the joy of it again. Those were the days when the stillness felt like failure, when motion without an audience seemed like a waste. But now? Now she stood still on purpose, so someone else could move. The dining room eased back into its rhythm. Plates arrived. Drinks were refreshed. The world continued turning. But in that tiny center where shoes met shoes, and silence became movement, something was shifting. Not just in Elliot, but in her. Because the truth was, Elliot wasn't the only one learning how to move again. And still, Mr. Blake said nothing. He didn't interrupt. Didn't record it. Didn't analyze it. He simply watched his son. And that made all the difference. That night, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in deep, where not even the HVAC hum distracts, and the light from the hallway feels like it has weight. Mr. Blake sat alone in his study, the overhead light casting a muted glow over the glass desk. On the screen of his laptop, a document waited to be sent. It was a comprehensive intervention plan, one he'd spent days assembling, cross-referencing therapies, exercises, nutritional protocols, and scheduling software. Everything was outlined in clinical precision. Subject: Elliot Blake, Revised Neuromotor Optimization Strategy. He read the title once. Then again. His cursor hovered over the send button. But something held him. He reached for his phone, the way most people do when they don't want to admit they're stalling. With a few swipes, he opened the video app and found what he was looking for. It was a short clip, less than 2 minutes. He had recorded it without realizing why. From across the restaurant, in that brief moment when instinct made him press record before understanding the significance of what he was seeing. He hit play. There they were. Hazel in her flats, Elliot on her shoes. The rhythm was almost imperceptible. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't even music matching. But it was deliberate. Organic. Like breath learning how to time itself. Hazel didn't guide him. She responded to him. Every awkward tilt, every unsure shift of Elliot's weight, she mirrored it, not to correct, but to confirm. Yes, I see that. I'll meet you there. She didn't instruct. She listened, with her body. And Elliot. Elliot smiled in a way Mr. Blake couldn't remember seeing. Not during therapy. Not at home. Not when praised. But here, in the quiet of this strange, improvised partnership, he looked free. Blake paused the video. The image froze on a single frame, Elliot mid-turn, leaning slightly back, trusting Hazel not to let him fall, and Hazel completely still, absorbing the trust like it was the most natural thing in the world. Blake stared at the frame for a long time. He glanced back at his screen. The email waiting to be sent. The file attached, 10 pages of plans and diagrams meant to help Elliot progress. But now it didn't look like help. It looked like a blueprint for control. And for the first time in his meticulously planned life, Blake felt unsure, not of the science, not of the methods, but of himself. He minimized the email and opened a folder on his desktop. Its name read, Fixing Elliot. It had been there for months. Inside were documents, prescriptions, meeting notes with specialists, weekly tracking graphs. The accumulation of a father's desperate effort to solve something that wasn't broken the way he thought it was. He hesitated, then right-clicked the folder. Selected, Rename. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, his mind returned to that dance, the slow, unsure steps that made no sense and yet somehow made everything feel right. Then he typed. His own rhythm. He hit enter. The new title blinked back at him. Blake leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. Not from work. Not from fatherhood. But from the realization that he had been chasing control when what Elliot needed was room. He didn't need to be led. Or fixed. Or fine-tuned. He needed someone who'd stand still and move only when he did. Just like Hazel had. Blake reopened the video. Watched the full thing again. This time, He didn't focus on Elliot's movements. He watched Hazel. Her stillness. Her grace. The subtle tilt of her head each time Elliot made a decision. The way she surrendered control so quietly, it looked like nothing at all. He closed the laptop. The unsent email still sat in the outbox. But it wouldn't be sent. Not tonight. Not ever. There was nothing wrong with helping your child. But there was something deeply wrong with needing to be the source of every step forward they took. Blake pressed his palms together, resting them against his lips. His son had danced. And not because of him. That truth didn't wound. It humbled. A week later, the restaurant was quieter than usual. It was early, before the weekend rush, before the music began, before the tables filled with chatter and clinking glasses. Hazel was wiping down the edge of a booth, her motions rhythmic, automatic. She hadn't expected to see him so soon. But there he was. Elliot. He walked in with a determined little gait, one foot dragging slightly more than the other, but purposeful. Mr. Blake followed behind, staying near the entrance. He didn't say anything. Didn't call out. Just watched. Elliot scanned the room, found Hazel, and smiled. Without a word, he walked over. He stopped just in front of her, bent down awkwardly, and tugged off his shoes. They were bright red today, slightly scuffed at the toes. He set them carefully to the side. Then he stepped forward. One foot. Then the other. Onto hers. Hazel looked down, surprised, but not startled. Her lips curved into a small, quiet smile. "You know the steps now," she said softly. Elliot looked up, eyes bright. He shook his head. "No," he replied. "But I know who follows." Hazel's chest rose just a little as she took that in. She didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. They stood still for a moment. And then gently, she shifted her weight, just enough that he could shift with her. And like before, it wasn't a dance. It was something older than rhythm. Something that didn't need to be named. At the edge of the room, Mr. Blake remained still. He didn't film it. He didn't call out to Elliot. He simply slipped his hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper. The edges were worn, soft with time. A child's drawing, crayon on cheap printer paper. It had been tucked away for too long. The picture was simple. Two people, one tall, one small, standing on a single pair of shoes. Their hands held mid-step, as if they were both learning together. Elliot had drawn it for his mother years ago, when she was still here. It had been one of her favorites. She used to keep it on the fridge. After she passed, Blake folded it up and carried it, never really knowing why. Until now. Because here it was, this impossible image. Made real. Not by a miracle. But by a girl in quiet shoes, who had simply stayed long enough for someone else to try. And that was enough. There comes a point in life when you realize that the most meaningful things you ever did were not the ones where you led, but the moments when you simply stayed, quiet, steady, and available. This story is not about grand gestures or perfect outcomes. It's about presence. About letting go of the need to fix, guide, or shape someone into what we think they should be, and instead allowing them the space to become who they are, even if that journey is unsteady and strange. Mr. Blake spent years trying to help his son through structure, technology, and expertise. And while none of that was wrong, it was only when he stepped back, when he allowed someone else to follow rather than lead, that he saw his child truly come alive. Hazel, the quiet waitress, didn't teach Elliot to dance. She didn't instruct, correct, or motivate. She just stood still long enough for him to try. She offered her shoes, not as direction, but as ground. And sometimes that's all someone needs, to stand on something steady until they believe in their own balance. For older audiences, especially those who have raised children, mentored others, or spent their lives offering advice, this story holds a tender reminder. The power of love is not always in doing more. Sometimes, it's in doing less. In trusting. in not interfering, in allowing someone the dignity of their own struggle, even when we want to reach out and guide them. It also speaks to grief, to carrying the image of something beautiful we once dreamed, like Mr. Blake did with his son's drawing, and seeing it come to life, not by our design, but by someone else's quiet generosity. In our later years, it becomes easier to see how fragile people truly are, not because they're weak, but because growth doesn't always look like strength. It often looks like wobbling, like trying, like dancing without knowing the steps. If there is a lesson to take from this story, it is this. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is not our help, but our stillness. Our willingness to follow, not because they know where they're going, but because they need someone who believes they'll get there. And in doing so, we often find that we too are changed. Not by doing more, but by finally understanding what it means to be enough, just by being there. If someone once let you stand on them, not to make you feel stronger, but simply so you wouldn't feel small. If your first steps were taken on borrowed steadiness, then remember this. Some people carry you, not with strength, but by letting you use what keeps them standing. Like and subscribe, and share in the comments, who once lent you their balance, so you could begin?